Have you ever seen a movie in theaters that you really liked and wanted to do super well at the box office and win a ton of awards at the Oscars, but then you find out that it ends up flopping and no one really talks about it afterwards? Now, there's a lot of factors as to why that happens. Maybe it wasn't advertised enough, or very little interest was generated. But regardless of the reason, flops hurt the studio producing the film financially, or at least sometimes they do. There are a good amount of films that flopped originally on release, but managed to garner attention and revenue in other places too. Films like The Wizard of Oz, The Shawshank Redemption, and The Shining had horrible box office numbers, but over the years turned into classics that are still talked about today. So in this video essay, I plan on showing and discussing the pros and cons of having a box office flop, and how it can actually help a studio succeed in the long run. So let me start with this. Not all box office failures are bad. A lot of them can either appeal to a niche audience, or just not be advertised as much as the bigger, more modern type films. A lot of studios place value on always being at the top. They're consistently searching for the next big thing, but it's the studios that take risks that are the ones that we remember. Legendary filmmaker Martin Scorsese said this: "Since the 80s, there's been a focus on numbers. It's kind of repulsive." Now, Scorsese is widely considered to be one of the most prominent directors in the industry working today, while never having a film that grossed in the top 200 of all time. His highest grossing film, The Wolf of Wall Street, made $400 million. His other films barely even got close. The Wolf of Wall Street stood out from other Scorsese films because it was based on a book that was also based on real-life events, and it was also a pretty straightforward character study. But people gravitated to it for other reasons. But there are other ways to make money in this industry, mainly merchandising and selling rights to streaming services. The studio A24 does this with their online shop, where you can buy merchandise based on their films. And that money goes right into funding their next film and helps them continue to make them in the future. So studios don't need to make the next big thing, they just need to be smart with the films that they have already. Bigger studios usually make films with the sole purpose of making money. They'll greenlight a film with the budget of Avengers Endgame and try to profit off of it. That happened with a film called The Lone Ranger, which had a budget of $250 million. And barely made its budget back. But nowadays people don't talk about the marketing costs. And with a movie like that, it would have had to make about $400 million to actually make its budget back when you consider the marketing. This loss of more than $100 million has sent Disney into a frenzy to try and recover. Frozen came out that year, and other profitable assets did well, but Disney put so much faith and money into The Lone Ranger that it ruined careers and hurt the studio. This is a quote talking about another film, John Carter, that also flopped and hurt Disney a lot. As a result, the board made Rich Ross, the head of Walt Disney Studios, resign. It was reported that Ross tried to blame Pixar for John Carter's failure, which alienated many executives in both Disney and Pixar. But The Lone Ranger also inspired other filmmakers to try something similar in their films. There have been films that took inspiration from The Lone Ranger, and without that movie we would not have them in the future. But just goes to show how Disney treats films that flop, which is not well. The Oscars have actually helped the film industry in a number of ways. While a lot of people hate them because of their picks, they've also put eyes on films that otherwise would flop. This last year I saw Past Lives, which was nominated for a few awards, and I loved it. But against this $12 million budget, it made $42 million, which is still pretty good, but compared to films that came out that year like Oppenheimer or Barbie, it's just no competition for the Oscars. Those films made more money and had more eyes on them over the year. And Past Lives had a smaller audience. A dedicated audience, but a small one. But the Oscars really like giving random films attention. For example, a few years ago, Babylon came out, which was one of the biggest box office flops of the year. Over $100 million spent and $64 million grossed. It led Damien Chazelle, the director, to be put in director jail because the film did so poorly. Which means that he's not allowed to direct anything for a while, even though he directed hits like Whiplash and La La Land. Babylon got a few Oscar nominations that year, but it ended up ruining careers. And it is fascinating for Babylon because while I was getting this idea together and looking for information, Margot Robbie, the star of the film, went on an interview and said this: "I don't get it either. I know I am biased because I'm very close to the project, and I obviously believe in it, but I still can't figure out why people hated it." And then went on to say that in 20 years it might be considered a classic. So the studio lost a lot of money for Babylon, but it might be thought of and remembered 20 years from now, when it appears on a random streaming service. It might find its audience then, because in theaters it definitely didn't. So there's hope for Babylon, and other films like it. In conclusion, we're seeing more box office bombs now than ever before. But if we remember those films, and enough eyes get on them over the years, they might become new classics down the road. We're seeing it with Babylon, with people coming around on it over the years. And if their failure was solely due to the marketing, then why are we hating on films that just came out? We should let them sit with us, let them stir for a number of years, and maybe we'll enjoy it later in life when we actually need them. Thank you for listening.